It is the spring of 1913, in a comfortable house in Essex, England. On the floor of a long room, a middle-aged man kneels beside a rumpled landscape of books, blocks, and clay hills. Around him are tiny painted soldiers, brass cannons, and toy trees. The man is Herbert George Wells, already famous for imagining Martians and time machines, and he is playing what he calls a game for boys. That year, Wells publishes a slim volume with a long subtitle. It is called Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. Beneath its playful tone lies a strange claim. Wells argues that his floor game, played with toy soldiers and a spring-loaded cannon, is a serious rehearsal of the folly of real war. To understand how a novelist came to invent the modern wargame, one must first understand the toys. In the late Victorian era, cheap metal figures flooded British nurseries. The firm of William Britton had perfected hollow-cast lead soldiers in 1893, making regiments affordable for middle-class households. For the first time, a writer's study could be transformed, in an afternoon, into a plausible battlefield. Wells was not the first grown man to take these toys seriously. In the Prussian court, as early as 1824, a lieutenant named Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Rieswitz had presented a wargame called Kriegspiel to the chief of the general staff. It used dice, rulers, and detailed maps to model artillery and infantry. Prussian officers came to believe it had sharpened the minds that won their wars against Austria and France. But Kriegspiel was a soldier's tool, thick with tables and umpires. Wells wanted something else. He wanted a game a civilian could play on a rainy afternoon without a manual as thick as a Bible. His path to it began, as he tells it, with a friend and a toy cannon. The friend was Jerome K. Jerome, the humorist who had written Three Men in a Boat. Visiting Wells's home, Jerome idly fired a spring-loaded breech-loading cannon made by the toymaker W. Britton across the room. A toy soldier fell over. In that small collapse, Wells later wrote, he saw the germ of a game. The projectile decided the casualty, not the roll of a die. From this accident, Wells built a system. He and his friends first called it Floor Games, and in 1911 he published a short book of that name describing how children and adults might build islands and cities from wooden blocks. Little Wars, 2 years later, took the same floor and turned it into a battlefield. The rules were tested over many evenings, refined by argument, and set down with the care of a man designing a small constitution. The mechanics were elegantly simple. Infantry moved 1 foot per turn, cavalry 2 feet, guns a foot when limbered up. A shot from the toy cannon knocked down whatever it struck, and any figure so felled was dead. Melee was resolved by counting figures within a set distance, with survivors calculated by a strict ratio. There were no dice, no umpires, and no charts. The cannon and the ruler did the arbitration. Wells's playmates were not children. They included the writer G.K. Chesterton, the philosopher A.C. Benson's Circle, and Wells's own sons, Frank and Jip. Photographs printed in the book show grown men in tweeds, kneeling behind cardboard hills, aiming brass barrels at painted lines of infantry. The captions describe imaginary generals with grand names, and imaginary countries with borders drawn on the study floor. There is a curious detail in Little Wars that sets it apart from earlier war games. Wells insists that a game may be lost as easily by ignoring supply and terrain as by losing a charge. He fusses over the placement of churches and farmhouses. He speaks of woods that block a gun's line of fire. Long before military theorists spoke of operational art, a novelist on his carpet was modelling logistics and cover. Yet the book is more than a rulebook. Its final chapter turns suddenly serious. Wells writes that he has set down these rules so that grown men who might otherwise be tempted by real war could work off their appetite for it in miniature. Play out your battle in a well-lit room, he suggests, and you will see how ugly and ridiculous the real thing must be. It is a pacifist argument, dressed in the costume of a nursery game. The timing of the book is haunting. Little Wars appeared in 1913. Within 18 months, the armies of Europe were marching into a real war of unprecedented scale. The friends who had knelt on Wells's floor would soon read casualty lists that made his imagined battles look, as he had hoped, ridiculous. Wells himself would lose acquaintances in the trenches, and his tone about war would darken for the rest of his life. Little Wars sold modestly on publication, and was, for a time, remembered mainly as a curiosity in the Wells bibliography. It sat between his scientific romances and his sprawling social novels, but it did not disappear. Copies passed through second-hand bookshops, and a small underground of hobbyists kept the game alive, refining its rules on their own floors. One of those hobbyists, decades later, was an American named Jack Scrooby. In the 1950s, from a small workshop in California, Scrooby began casting his own miniature soldiers and publishing a newsletter for fellow enthusiasts. He is often called the father of modern miniature wargaming, and he acknowledged Wells as the direct ancestor of the hobby. What Wells had done on a study floor, Scrooby helped turn into an international pastime. Meanwhile, another line of descent ran through the military itself. During the Cold War, the Rand Corporation and the United States Department of Defense revived the serious study of wargaming. They built elaborate simulations of nuclear exchange, insurgency, and crisis diplomacy. The direct lineage from Wells's floor to these classified rooms is contested by historians, but the underlying idea is the same. Play out the war before you fight it. In the 1970s, a different tributary emerged. Two Americans, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, adapted a set of medieval wargaming rules into a game they called Dungeons and Dragons. The rules descended, through several generations of hobby publications, from the miniatures tradition Wells had set in motion. From tabletop battles emerged the role-playing game, and from role-playing games would eventually emerge much of the vocabulary of modern video games. It is easy, from this distance, to overstate the line of descent. Wells did not single-handedly create the modern games industry, and he would probably have been baffled by most of it. But the essential trick of Little Wars, that a serious matter could be modelled by toys under agreed rules on a shared surface, is now everywhere. It runs beneath board games, computer simulations, and the training halls of general staffs. Wells lived long enough to see the world go through a second, greater war. He died in London in August 1946, a year after Hiroshima. His last books were bleak, disillusioned works, far from the buoyant confidence of his younger fiction. Little Wars, with its cannons and its earnest hope that men might exhaust their belligerents on a carpet, belongs to a lost world of Edwardian optimism. And yet the game endures. In hobby shops from Nottingham to Nagoya, painted regiments still advance across cloth hills, moved by rulers and by rules that trace their pedigree to that Essex study. Enthusiasts still refer to Wells's little book as a founding text. His imagined generals, with their absurd names and paper honours, march on in the games their descendants play. In the closing pages of Little Wars, Wells wrote that he would rather see statesmen settle their quarrels with tin soldiers than with living men. It was a modest wish, offered half in jest, in a room warm with lamplight and cigar smoke. A century later, on floors and screens around the world, people are still playing his game. Whether the statesmen have yet learned its lesson is another question entirely.